Greetings, Father Joe here, your friendly neighborhood pastor, coming to you from St. Patrick's Church in lovely Highland Mills, New York. Today is Tuesday of the 28th week in Ordinary Time, and yesterday we began reading from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Yesterday, St. Paul told us that the gospel was being preached to bring about the obedience of faith, and that is sadly lacking in our world and most modern people. It's lacking in our lives. St. Paul in today's reading says that he's not ashamed of the gospel. As a matter of fact, the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. But then St. Paul is going to go on and talk about God's wrath. And by the way, God's wrath does not mean he loses his temper. It does not mean that he's a petulant child somehow, who needs to be calmed down. God's wrath, basically, if you want a nice shorthand for God's wrath, God is love. He wants us to go to heaven. He wants to give us everything. He wants to protect us. When we turn away from God, we turn away from that love and that life and that protection, and our lives basically spiral out of control. God's mercy is when he does not give us what we ask for. But God's wrath does not mean that God is angry, sitting up on a cloud like Zeus with thunderbolts, hoping to wipe us out. But I do think that individually we see God's wrath. If you go out and you drink all night and you wake up the next morning hungover, you can say, oh my gosh, this is God punishing me. But it's not. It's me suffering the effects of, my consequences of my acts. St. Paul then speaks about the origin of this, is that when we refuse to worship God, who has revealed himself, he's not even talking here about revealed religion. He's talking about kind of a natural revelation of God, that God has been revealing himself in his creation. And when we refuse to see that and to believe in it and to worship him, then we start worshiping false gods. And when we start worshiping false gods, then we worship, or we try to bring about whatever we think that means. And I just think it's the origin of a lot of our individual, familial, societal, religious community problems. We desperately need to return to a worship of God. When we worship God, we put not only our lives, but all of creation back in order. It's one of the things that we do when we worship as a community. We participate in the offering of Jesus, but we also reorder our lives and we reorder our society. And our society is desperately, desperately in need of this power of God to bring sanity and to bring salvation. But it begins with our worshiping God, not worshiping ourselves, not worshiping some false image of God who's a butler who's going to walk around and wait on us. We need to proclaim that Jesus Christ is King, that he has the authority in our life, and that we are ready to receive this power of God for our salvation, for the salvation of our friends and our families, and ultimately our world. So for today, let us ask God to give us the grace to worship him in truth.